Ya, banyak ya, banyak. Dan ia di-embrace sebagai satu yang tradisi ataupun um, rawatan prevention yang sebenarnya ada banyak khasiatnya. Dan if you look at the modern medicine pun mereka menggunakan khasiat-khasiat ini juga dalam supplements pil-pil suplemen juga ya, dan dijual mahal. Tapi di Indonesia ini sudah lama diterima pakai dan menjadi tradisi yang sampai sekarang ya, kita sentiasa tahu khasiat dia. Dan kalau di Malaysia pun kalau kita pakai jamu-jamu di Indonesia, kita rasa macam memang memberi solusi yang baik, especially kalau selepas bersalin contohnya, boleh dapat kembali pinggang yang ramping. Itu adalah idea-idea yang adalah mengenai jamu. Dan kita fikir, kita rasakan ini adalah adalah contoh yang kita boleh embrace dalam berkomunikasi berkenaan kesihatan. Yeah, we don't have to always think about supplementary pills when we have our own here. Dan ini yang sebenarnya harus kita fikirkan, bagaimana untuk kita menembus untuk kesihatan di peringkat kita dan juga antarabangsa. Next, saya ingin menarik perhatian kepada satu kes ataupun satu contoh yang berlaku di Malaysia ketika pandemik COVID-19. Ketika ini kita semua berada dalam movement control order dalam keadaan kuarantin ya. Di Indonesia juga begitu kan? Ada saya dipanggil di Indonesia apa ya? Saya lupa sudah. Tetapi ketika itu kan kita lihat ada satu krisis yang berlaku kerana apabila masyarakat kita tidak bekerja, tidak ada keuangan, penjanaan keuangan, a lot of families suffered economically. Dan in terms of kesihatan juga, kita takut ya, gentar ketika itu tentang COVID-19 kerana kita tidak tahu apa yang akan berlaku dan banyak juga kematian yang berlaku ke awal. Di sini satu keajaiban yang berlaku yang menarik kerana di Malaysia berlakunya satu grassroots social movement yang dinamakan #KitaJagaKita yang diwujudkan oleh masyarakat sendiri, created by the people, for the people. Ini menunjukkan kuasa masyarakat kita untuk menyelesaikan masalah dari segi ekonomi rakan-rakan yang sedang struggle economically. Masalah dari segi even public health, di mana different institution, individuals start making PPEs, start menjahit PPEs, people coming together to help the government untuk protect our own nation. So #KitaJagaKita tidak dirancang oleh mana-mana agensi government. Ia adalah kuasa rakyat kita sendiri yang bangkit untuk menyelesaikan masalah yang ada. So it is a Malaysian story of altruism, hope and compassion for each other. Ini adalah something yang amazing yang saya rasa tidak berlaku di tempat lain. Next. Dan KitaJagaKita bukan sahaja stop di situ. Ada spill over communication campaign itu yang diwujudkan oleh masyarakat kita sendiri, masyarakat Malaysia sendiri kepada krisis-krisis lain. Contohnya #Bendera Putih yang memberi satu cara untuk masyarakat tidak malu bersuara jika mereka memerlukan pertolongan di COVID-19 dan juga di krisis banjir yang berlaku selepas itu. ya dalam beberapa tahun selepas COVID-19. So it's not just a one-off campaign. Bila kita cakap tentang kempen komunikasi ataupun kempen kesihatan, kementerian biasanya akan melancarkan satu kempen perangi gula ke contohnya. Tetapi ia tidak sensitif. Ia hanya memberi awareness kepada kempen tersebut tanpa mendorong kita untuk cut sugar in our daily diet. So it is interesting how kita boleh lihat potensi komunikasi dalam create dan menyebarluaskan kempen kesihatan atau kempen apa-apa sahaja yang boleh mendorong perubahan tingkah laku yang sangat organik dan lestari. Yeah. Next. Dan apa yang sebenarnya wujud yang berbeza dengan kempen-kempen yang datang daripada atas ini, dari wahyu, adalah kerana the social behaviour change tersebut diwujudkan oleh komuniti sendiri. By the people themselves. Dan oleh kerana itu ada sense of belonging, sense of ownership, social capital, unity and trust. So ini perkongsian positive emotion, self-efficacy, membina negara, membina bangsa yang berupaya untuk menyelesaikan masalah sendiri dan diperkasakan secara organik untuk bergerak dan sentiasa bergerak, dan ini sebenarnya lebih bagus daripada memberi keuangan untuk melancarkan kempen-kempen yang bersifat one-off yang tidak ada impaknya yang dirasai oleh masyarakat. Okay, next. Saya ingin menarik sedikit dan connect sedikit tentang apa yang berlaku currently. Saya yakin rakan-rakan sekalian tahu tentang sumut flotilla, ya? Tahu tentang sumut Nusantara, pelayaran humanitarian daripada negara-negara di Asia Tenggara yang mengikut sumut Nusantara Global Flotilla untuk memberi bantuan kemanusiaan kepada saudara-saudara kita di Palestin. Dan bagaimana ini juga people-led, this is people-led convoy, ya, daripada Malaysia dan 989 other countries, sebenarnya termasuk juga Indonesia, walaupun yang gelombang kedua ini ada Indonesia tidak bersama dalam kapal, tetapi kita bersatu dari segi memberi dan menjana keuangan dan barang-barang humanitarian yang disampaikan. Sekali lagi, this is not government's, this is actually a proof that the government has failed untuk membantu menyelesaikan masalah. Tetapi rakyat yang cuba untuk menyelesaikan masalah dunia. This is hope. This represents our ability, our power to create change from within. Dan inilah sebenarnya yang lebih kuat. Saya, seperti mana yang saya katakan, macam fast food tadi kan. Kita semua tahu kan fast food, tapi semua orang masih lagi makan fast food, ya. Tetapi kerana ada boykot Israel, ramai yang sudah boykot McDonald's. Di Malaysia memang ramai yang boykot McDonald's, di Indonesia juga ada, ya, yang boykot McDonald's. Ya. Dan ia memberi impak kepada ekonomi, tetapi spillover efeknya lagi bagus orang tidak makan makanan fast food. Ya. Saya dah berusaha banyak kali untuk memberhentikan orang daripada makan fast food, tidak berjaya, tapi oleh kerana ada boykot ini berjaya. Kerana ia adalah cara kita untuk menyelesaikan masalah. We are using our power and tapping into our strength. And this is where kita kadang-kadang tak nampak, tapi kita sangat kuat. Seperti pepatah Melayu ada mengatakan, bersatu kita teguh. bercerai, kita roboh. So this is also just to like link it to the more recent issues yang berkaitan dengan perubahan sosial dan tingkah laku. Okay, next. So apa yang saya ingin katakan bahawa kita perlu ada perubahan yang datang dari diri, a change from within. Okay? Apabila kita recognize bahawa manusia mempunyai fundamental rights to drive decisions, kita punya decisions that affects our lives, kehidupan kita, we need to embrace more community-led, people-centered approaches. Kita harus libatkan masyarakat dan komuniti dalam merangka program, intervensi dan cara-cara untuk kita sama-sama menyelesaikan masalah. Community-driven framework, respect the voices of our people, and respect the voices of people who are marginalized, vulnerable population. Dan ini adalah cara kita untuk maju ke hadapan yang boleh saya katakan berkait juga dengan apa yang Prof Kadang katakan semalam, development first, tapi kita dahulukan mindset acuan kita, ya, kita punya kekuatan kita. Okay, next. Dan saya fikir inilah cara kita untuk move forward. Kita harus bertanya sentiasa, realiti siapa yang kita ingin ubah? Adakah kita melihat kepada komuniti orang asli itu sebagai komuniti yang lebih rendah daripada kita yang kita ingin ubah? Mereka yang hidup dalam komuniti tersebut, realiti mereka yang kita cuba ubah. Siapa kita? Kita yang dianggap pakar, adakah kita sebenarnya tahu dan mendalami all the challenges yang dirasai oleh komuniti? Mungkin tidak. Kita harus menggunakan prinsipal yang multidisciplinary, tidak hanya bekerja dalam disiplin masing-masing. Harus juga libatkan pakar-pakar daripada different disiplin. Multi-level, bukan saja di universitas, di community level juga, melibatkan para pemerintah juga. We must look at different multi-perspective. Dan perubahan ini haruslah mempunyai approach yang ecosystemic agency dan memperkuatkan dan memperkasakan kekuatan kita. Next. So ini adalah yang saya ingin kiranya tamatkan speech saya dengan kata-kata ini. Kita harus bertanya pada diri kita, apakah peranan yang kita ada untuk facilitate, bukan untuk dictate, facilitate the change from within. Bagaimana kita bersama-sama komuniti dan pelbagai pemegang taruh merangka satu cara, acuan kita sendiri untuk berubah agar lebih lestari. Apa yang kita boleh belajar daripada past experience kita? I really believe that working with communities to understand what drives decision making should be our guiding compass in order to increase the quality of our planning in creating a meaningful, sustainable change. Next. Oleh itu, saya ingin mengakhiri keynote speech saya dengan ribuan terima kasih for all the attention and perhatian yang diberikan, dan saya harap, saya menyeru agar kita semua bersama-sama menguatkan disiplin kita, koordinasi kita, kolaborasi kita untuk mewujudkan perubahan yang lebih lestari yang datang dari kita sendiri. The power of the global south. Sekian, terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Professor Madya Dr. Emma Mirzawati Mohammed, for your enlightening presentation and valuable insights. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give her a warm round of applause. Distinguished guests, professor, and ladies and gentlemen, we now move forward to the next keynote presentation. It is our great honor to invite Her Excellency, Professor Catherine Robinson, to deliver the second keynote presentation titled Migration Regimes and Intimacy, Marriage Migration in Globalizing World. In this keynote, Professor Robinson will explore how globalization has shaped patterns of marriage migration and how intimate relationships are influenced by social, cultural, and economic structure that cross national borders. Your Excellency, Professor Catherine Robinson, the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much to the Dean, Prof. Benny, and Dr. Erna. Where's Dr. Erna for inviting me? So thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's a real extra thrill for me, not just to be at Pajajaran, but to meet these wonderful colleagues from Malaysia. It's been a real treat to hang out with you guys and learn and hear your talks. Prof. Hahrudin yesterday and Prof. Emma just now. So it's a wonderful treat for me. Maaf ya, I wrote my paper in English and saya rasa malu ya kan sudah dikalahkan oleh rekan-rekan dari Malaysia, tapi saya khawatir kalau saya coba membawa makalah saya dengan terjemahan kilat oleh saya sendiri, mungkin nanti kita tidak dapat makan siang ya, lama sekali. Jadi maaf ya, tapi kalau maaf ya kalau bahasa saya kurang jelas atau kalimat saya terlalu panjang. But as the moderator said, I want to talk about migration. And we know that in the world that we live in, migration rates are increasing all the time. Makin hari makin menambah ya, because we have political crises all over the world, like the crisis in Gaza that we were just looking at. We have global warming, which in Indonesia is already forcing lots of people in low-lying coastal communities to have to move somewhere else for their livelihoods. So migration's not going to stop. It's going to keep getting bigger and bigger. And of course, the drivers of migration are presumed in political discourse and political negotiation to be political and economic. But what I want to talk about today are those aspects of migration that are outside the political and the economic, but nonetheless cross-cut economic and political issues. Now, if we think about, if you're as old as me, you can remember the last century. And in the last century, I think especially around the middle of the century onwards towards the end, migration was celebrated. It was seen as an important driver of globalization that was making everybody in the world richer. It was seen as something that was not just it didn't overcome these dynamics of North and South that Dr. Emma was talking about, but it was allowing countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to experience, it was helping that process where they could recruit labor from other places and have increased rates or move labor around in their countries, have increased rates of economic growth. But also, some of you may remember, in the late 20th century, there was a great celebration of what people call cosmopolitanism. It was seen as a positive value to be mixing with people from other communities and experiencing other kinds of value systems. Now, we can see at the moment, coming out of Europe and North America, but even last week in Australia, the rise of an anti-immigration discourse, which in a way is trying to entrench the power of, excuse me, I'm a feminist, the white men who have long held on to power in the global north. And there's a great outpouring of violence and anger in a movement that's called identitarianism. That's what they talk about in Europe. Last week in Australia, we had the March for Australia, where people were under the fantasy or delusion, if you like, that in a country where 52% of the population were either born overseas or have a parent born overseas, that there's something called the Australian way of life or the Australian ideal, which trumps all of those other kinds of ways of life in our multicultural community. So, but migration's not going to go away. The people who run things in the world still get a lot of benefits out of people moving into places where they can be used as cheap labour. But also we have the experience of what we might call the brain drain, where, you know, people from countries like Indonesia and Malaysia that are highly skilled and so on are attracted to countries in the global north who get the benefit of their expertise and their skills without having paid the costs of social reproduction. Who paid for the costs of all those, you know, IT guys and so on that are migrating to America from India, for example? Anyway, so that's the kind of picture I think that we can think about migration, that it's still an essential driver of globalization. Oh, sorry. Can we see my first slide? Not this one yet. We're not up to this yet. Just slide one, the first one. This one, yeah. So when Dr. Erna asked me to talk at this conference and she gave me a list of conferences, I thought, oh, this is an opportunity to talk about my new book, or book last year, this book, which is about marriage migration to Australia. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But I think the context for this talk in this particular forum is that Indonesia and Malaysia are very strongly linked by not just modern migration, but long-standing historical traditions of migration. And we'll get to that in a moment. While officially sponsored labour migration between Indonesia and Malaysia began in the 1970s, as the Suharto regime saw labour migration as a way to counter unemployment at home, it really took off in the 1980s. And I was living in Indonesia at the time, and I remember this really well, where you began to have the mass movement of female domestic servants from Indonesia, first of all, to the Middle East, but soon they began going to East Asia, Singapore, and Malaysia. Now, what I was interested in this book that I wrote was about a history of transnational, transcultural or cross-cultural marriage migration to Australia. And I'll get onto that a little bit in a moment. But the main discourses in public policy fields around migration are about economics and politics, and the kind of politics of regulating citizenship and regulating movement across borders, you know, keeping people out and being careful who you let in. But marriage migration raises, I think, a different set of issues that really go to these humanitarian issues that Dr. Emma was talking about. And I wrote down her conclusion, and I'll come back to this later. People have a fundamental right to drive decisions that affect their lives, and that's, in a way, that's a bit of a theme of my paper too, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And I'll just read you a quote from somebody called Rachel Tan, who is the program director of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, which I think is in Malaysia. And earlier this year, at a forum, she made this comment. Marriage migration is a major yet overlooked form of cross-border movement, particularly for women. And she says, while labour migration has long been a dominant form of migration, shaping policy and discourse, marriage migration is equally shaped by gendered, economic, and social inequalities. So that's basically what I want to talk about. So the desire of individuals to partner someone of their choice, to seek intimacy in transcultural and transnational relationships, is at odds with national governments' powers and desires to regulate movements of people across borders. And as I said, this book reports on research that I conducted in Australia with Asian Australian couples, most usually Australian men and Asian women. And these marriages became the subject of a very nasty, pejorative public debate in Australia in the 1980s, at a time when a lot of men who'd come to Australia as single male labourers, migrants, who lived in remote communities like mining towns or dam construction sites, began seeking pen pal relationships. There was an organised system. You know, you put an ad in a particular paper called, it was Australian Singles, an Australasian Post. He said pen pal wanted, you know, with an intention of marriage. So these people engaged in what's been called correspondence courtship. And this gave rise to this pejorative stereotype that you may have heard, the mail order bride, which is very insulting. It implies that the women have absolutely no agency, that they're just putting themselves in a shop window and waiting for some man to say, I'll have her, thank you very much, when nothing could be further from the truth. But also the north-south divides came into play here, because the women who were from poorer Asian countries were rather nastily suspected of being gold diggers. You know, that, oh, they could really hit the bonus by marrying an Australian man, what a prize, you know, that kind of thing. But also feminist critiques came into play. So rather than, I'm a feminist, but I don't agree with a lot of the position that Australian feminists took up in relation to this issue, which is partly why I did the research. So the women who were regarded as lacking in agency and gold diggers were treated with scorn by these women, who completely stripped them of their agency, as the men were labelled as loser men who couldn't stand up to a good, you know, red-blooded Aussie woman. So these meek and mild Asian women, little did they know, were going to, you know, find themselves a kind of a pliant Asian bride. Now, I got into this because someone asked me to write a commentary for a journal, because a man, an Australian academic who was white Australian man who was an academic, was married to a Filipina, and he'd submitted an article to a journal which wasn't very well argued, but what he was trying to do was make a positive intervention in this debate. You know, and so the acting editor accepted the article, and when the real editor came back, they were really angry that they were going to publish this. So they asked me to write something, and I didn't realise they then published it as a separate article, as a comment. But I'm an anthropologist, and so the questions that immediately came up for me were, well, what are these as marriages? You know, what are the issues around family formation and spousal relationships when people are entering into this really quite brave step of marrying someone from another culture, from another country. And at the time, this is in the 1980s, there was a common cultural discourse around the family from kind of leftist critiques of capitalism, but where the family was seen as, do you remember, some of you may remember the phrase from Christopher Lash, the haven in the heartless world. The family was seen as the sphere of intimate relationships where people in capitalist societies found respite from the alienation of capitalist labour relations and capitalist class relations. But I think we have to say also, thinking about family formation, in all societies, the family remains the site of social reproduction. We had a few early 20th century experiments in collective child rearing, like the Israeli kibbutz, the Cuban and Chinese communes, you know, where children weren't raised in families but were raised in institutions. but these social experiments have not survived. And social reproduction is a positive consequence of migration regimes, whereas it leads to permanent settlement and stability and growth in the population. So so I was interested in these personal dimensions. What about the children? I think sometimes people now talk about third culture children, some of whom come from these sorts of relationships. How are spousal relationships and family relationships married? Because for an Australian man marrying a Filipina, for example, he just doesn't have a bride. He's got a mother-in-law, brothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, and in a lot of cases, stepchildren, because a lot of these women were divorced or widowed. So how are these kinds of relationships managed? Because extended families are not a really big deal in Australia. But so these were interesting questions to me. Anyway, when I started doing my research, can we have the next slide? Next slide. Yeah, okay. So you probably all know, I don't want to bore you with too much about the history of Australia, but you all know it began as a convict settler colony in the late 18th, early 19th century. And of course, who were the convicts? Mostly men. I forget the statistic, but it was something like 90% men. And so it was a bit of a wild and woolly place. But in England, they became interested in this idea that white settlement could spread out over the whole continent. So you had this predatory desire to expand and take over the continent, but also a terrible racist and predatory attitude to the Indigenous people. So it wasn't seen as this possibility that, Indigenous women were raped for sure. And that gave rise to, the fact that a lot of most Indigenous people in Australia today are of mixed race. But you had these schemes to import women required for white population increase. And this was the strategy. And I found out when I was doing this research that two of my great-great-grandmothers came this way. One was a convict and two of them came this way, that they would advertise. Oh, this one is actually specifically for marriage, but the idea was usually that these young women, poor women in England, Scotland, and Ireland, would answer an ad to go and work as a domestic servant in the colonies. But the ads often said, well, we're going to get you a job as a domestic servant, but there's a lot of men out there. You're going to be able to get yourself a husband. Yeah. So this was attractive. And you can imagine these women. I mean, the convicts had no choice. They were put on these horrible ships and, these terrible journeys, months and months at sea, etc. These women actually took the brave step of deciding that they would take their chance and go to Australia. So these early years of settler colonialism in Australia showed the patterns we see in transnational migration today. The motives of migrants are not singular. Desire for economic betterment, the desire for marriage and family and intimacy are all mixed together. But government regimes and these personal ambitions may be in tension. Remember, who's got the right to make decisions about their own lives? And migration regimes cut across the rights of individuals to make decisions about their own lives. There was a slow trickle of non-British migration to these colonies through the 19th century. The colonies joined to form the nation of Australia in 1901. Now, this trickle of migration through the 19th century were mostly single men, and in the case of small communities of Italians, some Syrians, etc., they returned back to the countries they came from to marry because they weren't allowed to bring women. And I think the most famous case that I think people in Indonesia and Malaysian people would find interesting is the case of the Pashtun. In Australia, they're called the Afghan Cameleers, but of course, at that time, there was no Afghanistan. There was just part of the British Empire on the border between India and Pakistan called Pashtun. And these men were cameleers, and they were brought to Australia with their camels in order to explore the inland. So all of the people who are celebrated as these heroic figures who conquered the inland, really a lot of credit has to go to the cameleers, because there was no, how else did you get there? There were no roads, no, etc., etc. But these men were not, they bring camels, but not wives. So many of these people intermarried with Indigenous Australians, and the oldest Muslim communities in Australia are in the northern part of South Australia, you know, the wild places that the Cameleers helped open up for white settlement, and also in Alice Springs. And the people who are the members of those Muslim communities are mixed race descendants or mixed culture descendants of Indigenous people, Australian Indigenous people, and the Pashtun Cameleers. Now, the next slide. The other thing that really interested me as a form of marriage migration, we have the next slide. Yeah. Can anyone guess what these pictures are? After World War II, Australia embarked on a big program of national development, with lots of opening up mining areas, buildings of dams in the interior and so on, but they needed labour. And because of the White Australia policy, the first legislation that was passed by the Australian government when it was formed in 1901 was the Immigration Restriction Act, which restricted immigration to white people. So they went to Europe. They first of all tried to get, you know, very lily white Scandinavians, couldn't make it. So they went to the next best place, which was Southern Europe. So lots of Greek and Italian men were recruited as labourers. Same problem. They come to Australia. They're often in a remote community, which is a majority male community. If they have a legitimate personal desire to form a family, to have a personal life, to have children, what are they meant to do? And so in the 1950s, you had this, what they called marriage by proxy. So both the Greek Orthodox and the Italian churches allowed this. So the men would write back letters going by ship, you know, over the seas. They'd write back to their villages that they came from, and they would find a wife. Sometimes it might have been someone they knew when they were a child, but sometimes not. And what would happen would be this woman would stand up in church next to another man who was the proxy, and the priest would marry them. This enabled them to get a visa as a fiancé. So what you see here are these men who are all waiting on Circular Quay in Sydney. If you've been to Sydney, you know Circular Quay, where the ships come in. So the men there are all these single male migrants who are waiting for their wives, who they've never met in most cases. And these are the women. See the women here on the edge of the ship, and they're all anxiously looking too to think which one's going to be mine. So this has been the story behind the formation of a lot of the really well-known Italian families in Australia, like, for example, my local supermarket. The grandparent generation who started the supermarket were an Italian couple where the wife came as a proxy bride. Yeah, so this is a long history. So the men who were the male migrants after this generation, who were then I'm not quite sure why this practice stopped, but anyway, they then turned to this other form of correspondence marriages where they're writing mainly to Filipinas and having this correspondence courtship. The women get fiancé visas. They come to Australia. They marry, etc. This has been going on for a long time now. And of course, because Australia is such a multicultural society, there's a lot of desire by people not just to bring wives to Australia, but to bring elderly parents, to bring other family members, to bring children, etc., etc. But under the 1958 Immigration Act, which was the first act after that 1901 Act, which set up the White Australia policy, the 1958 Immigration Act sets up different categories of migration. So labour migration is capped. You're only allowed to have, they change the caps every year. There's only allowed to be so many caps. But family migration, like spousal, fiancé, family reunion, was meant to be uncapped, which reflected the fact that in law, Australians have a right to marry who they want and to have that person live with them in Australia. So just last week, there's been a big debate again about Australia's immigration policy and so on. Now, what's been happening over the years, they haven't capped family migration, but they've put in long waiting times and increased the fees. So people who want to bring their spouse to Australia are facing incredible kind of obstacles. So in practice, the rights of citizens to live with overseas-born spouses and children of that marriage are declining because of these obstacles that are being put in place by the administrative regime. But when I did my research, and you can read my book online if you like, if you think it sounds interesting, but of course I found that these were very interesting and ordinary families. Can we see the next slide? I hope it's the one I want. Yeah. Now, in some ways, these Filipina bride migrants are absolutely like ideal citizens. Look at this. I love this picture. This is the Filipino Australian Community Australia Day Festival. And because my research focused on Filipinas, I know more about them than I do other groups. But they form very nice community-based organisations to kind of help each other, because they're not getting much help from anybody else, quite frankly. And they form these networks they're often in quite small towns. Like one of my research sites was a place in South Australia where they're men who served in World War II. They're soldier settlements. The men served in World War II and got a little parcel of land, and they grow fruit. So these women who've been urban, secretaries, teachers, whatever, find themselves in Australia as farmers' wives, which is a very particular kind of role for women, being a farmer's wife. I won't go into that here. You can read it in the book. So, and of course, as we would expect, the realities of their lives had no basis in these stereotypes. And in fact, within these families, the idea of cultural difference was actually, I call it a kind of a frisson. It made them more romantically interesting to both of the partners, the fact that there were these differences. But the thing that I found very distressing was that everybody had anecdotes about how this stereotype of mail order bride affected the way people talk to them. And I live in Canberra, where there's a quite a big Indonesian community, and I'm quite connected to that as my friendship group. And a lot of people in that community, a typical picture would be an Indonesian woman who met her husband when either he was working in Jakarta or they were both studying at the same university or something like that. So a lot of them are professional. One is an architect who runs her own firm. Another one was one of the librarians at the National Library, whatever. But another one that I'm very close to is librarian at the ANU. And these women said to me that they feel this power of the mail order bride, that they're often treated with a lack of respect, or the assumption that they're almost akin to prostitutes, because they've come here and married a white man. One of the husbands told me that when he came home with his very well-educated professional wife, she's actually from Bandung, the neighbour over the fence said, "Oh, you got yourself a man." So the negative stereotype is very painful and hurtful, and bears no relation at all to the fact that these families create successful. They have no higher divorce rates than Australians in general, etc. And when you say to the children, "What's it like living in a cross-cultural marriage?" and they look at you and they say, "Oh, my mum makes really good lumpia." Like it doesn't really impact on the way they live their lives, because for them, their parents are mum and dad. Anyway, let's get on to Malaysia. Can we see the next slide? Malaysia and Indonesia. This is just from Robert Cribb's historical Atlas of Indonesia, and it just shows you the very deep historical patterns of migration of the Bugis from Sulawesi, which includes onto the Malay Peninsula. So I just thought that's an interesting slide to look at while I make this comment. So Indonesia and Malaysia have a really long migration history, and it goes way back before the colonial settlement of the borders that became the basis of the modern nation states, and also way prior to the achievement of nation statehood by both those countries. Malaysia has historic communities that acknowledge cultural identities that link them to populations in Indonesia, and some of you probably fit this category. The Minangkabau, the Acehnese, the Bugis, the Madaris, the Banjaris. You've got people in Malaysia, as I understand, who identify with all those socio-cultural identities. Now, I mostly know about the Bugis because my main research has been in South Sulawesi. But the Bugis have a strong tradition of marantau and extends to Malaysia and also before federation to the north coast of Australia, before the White Australia policy. And also out-migration has been political due to the colonial settlement of of this part of the world and whatever. So that, for example, a lot of Bugis, there was a huge amount of Bugis migration in the 17th century after the colonial defeat of Sultan Hasanuddin of Goa. So a lot of these migrations are really old, and so sometimes many generations, and because especially aristocratic Bugis, for example, are very interested in genealogies, they know who they are. So, for example, in Makassar many years ago, someone brought someone to my house who was from, I think, Johor, and he was a young man of Bugis. He identified as Bugis. He was of Bugis descent, but a Malaysian. And he was coming back to Sulawesi to find his family because, they knew, because they keep the genealogies and their family stories, where to go to look. I remember a few years ago, you all know Prof. Shafri Shairin from UGM, who was my classmate at ANU. Anyway, Prof. Shafri said to me, he showed me a research report he'd done, where he asked Indonesian labour migrants in Malaysia if they could solve their labour permit problems, etc., by taking Malaysian citizenship if it was offered, would they? And it was very interesting because the only group of Indonesian migrants that definitively refused were Javanese. So these other communities, the Bugis, the Minang, the Acehnese, where you've got these long historical roots, perhaps I'm speculating, but perhaps those socio-cultural identities are really almost stronger than the issue of citizenship. Now, migration between Indonesia is regulated by laws which prescribe the possibilities for marriage of Indonesian labour migrants, and it's for both legal and illegal migrants. And you can correct me if I've got my information wrong here, because I'm not an expert on Malaysia, but the Malaysian Immigration Act 1959-1963 says the foreign worker is not allowed to marry any local resident or migrant worker who works in the country. If a foreign worker with a temporary work visit pass marries, the contract will be terminated and the foreign worker will be sent home. But of course we know that of the as estimated 28 million Indonesian workers in Malaysia, how many I forget, but a lot of them are illegal. Where the prohibitions, I think, are even stronger. The foreign worker is not allowed to bring his or her family to live in Malaysia. So the migrant workers have to kind of prescribe this status that they must live in Malaysia as single individuals. But why does the Malaysian government not want them to marry? And one researcher that I found quoted an Indonesian consul in Johor that said it's intended to minimise unwanted consequences for Malaysia as a nation. If foreign workers were given permission to marry legally, then the government would need to provide insurance, school, healthcare facilities, and any other child-related needs. And if the migrant worker is a woman and she works in a refinery, factory, or something like that, lives in a dormitory, then the employer would need to provide facilities for her husband and also for any children. So there's sort of economic reasons, I suppose. You cut costs. You don't want to provide these services for migrants. But of course, what's the missing? What would you call it? The log in your eye about this situation. Indonesians, and especially those groups, the Minang, the Acehnese, the Buginese, the Banjarese, Maduris, are Muslim, as are, is it the majority of the population of Malaysia, right? So now marriage is a sacred obligation for Muslims, and it's a religious matter. It's something between two individuals, regularized by a contract, overseen by a religious celebrant. And indeed, for some Indonesian Muslims, marriage is seen as a form of ibadah. Jadi, it's a keharusan. Mau tidak mau, you need to marry. So there's strong tension, I would argue, between the Islamic regulation of marriage and the value of marriage for Muslim peoples and the state regimes, which deny the rights of migrants to marry or to hold rights in marriage. Attitudes to marriage, morality, and cultural practice make it very difficult to ban Muslim marriage, between people who might be citizens of different countries, but they are Muslims. And I think an important thing to remember is that a lot of the migrants, international migrants, are young adults who are exactly at the time of their lives where they're sexually active, but also, where they're having an expectation of family formation. Now, a number of researchers have described the prevalence of the practice that migrant workers who are forbidden by law to marry contract Islamic marriages, akad nikah, with other Indonesian workers, with Malaysian citizens, but also foreign workers from other countries like Bangladeshis, for example. These marriages follow Islamic prescriptions and are conducted by an individual with religious authority, which could be a village imam. The Bugis, for example, have a practice of hereditary imam. Or it could be an ustaz. And one of the researchers described how in Sabah, for example, people took advantage of the consulate inviting an ustaz to give a sermon at Idul Fitri or something like that, to get that person to marry them. These marriages are termed kawin siri, kawin di bawah tangan, or nikah kampung. And it's seen as an Islamic response to the potential problem of illicit sexuality, but also issues of shame, because these Indonesian migrants, as I don't know a lot about in Peninsular Malaysia, but in Sabah, for example, they're working on plantations, they live in communities with other migrants, maybe from the same community as them. For Bugis, this issue of shame is very strong. Yeah, so you would not want to be bringing shame on yourself and your family and your community by engaging in an illicit relationship. In Indonesia, I'm sure you all know, there are many practices that regulate marriage at local level that are not the practices required under state law. So, for example, Ilmi Idrus conducted research in Pinrang, South Sulawesi, which is one of the areas that sends a lot of, they call themselves pasamikole, people who've been smuggled, a lot of illegal migrants to Sabah. But she describes the activities of someone she calls the Imam Liar, who marries and divorces people, and he even issues them with a surat, a letter of a surat nikah or a surat cerai, which kind of mirip, the documents that you get from the Kantor Urusan Agama. His services are frequently, but not necessarily, accompanied by public rituals and feasting that are the social acknowledgement of valid marriages, including those solemnized by officials from the KUA. For many people, kawin liar is considered an alternative way to get married, for example, because they're in Malaysia and they can't marry legally, or in other Bugis communities because they're already married back in their home village and they want to have a wife in the rantau. But for many people, they don't see the difference. They don't understand what's the difference between, for example, in Indonesia, a marriage that's been registered with the KUA and one that's been solemnized by the Imam Liar. And Idris quotes one woman saying, it's just a little piece of paper. And the Imam Liar stated he'd become an Imam Liar based on social demand in relation to fornication. As he said, how can I neglect people engaging in sex outside marriage when there's another way to marry them off? It's true I marry them, boo, but they're the ones get married, not me. I only help them to avoid fornication, zina. If the government considers this as a wrong, arrest me. So he sees himself as doing something really important in helping Muslims avoid zina. The acceptance of kawin liar as an alternative to legal marriage may also be based on the idea that marriage is a private business that should fall outside state jurisdiction. And remember, Indonesia only passed a secular marriage law in 1974, and it had been a very contentious issue since even before independence. It was opposed by many Muslim organisations. Even the women's organisations in the Kowani, in the Congress Wanita Indonesia, opposed the idea of there being a secular regulation of marriage. An important role of the Imam Liar, now that there are large volumes of migrants working on the plantations in Sabah from Pinrang, is to provide a divorce decree for women who've been abandoned by migrating husbands, as this is not uncommon. And so, you know, the men may have had a kawin siri with somebody in Malaysia, even though they've already got a wife in Pinrang. But where does that leave the wife? She's in kind of limbo because she can't move on. She's not divorced. She can't marry again. So the Imam Liar performs this service of giving the women a divorce certificate so they can move on, and then he'll marry them to somebody else. Yeah. Oh, have we got... have I got any more time left? 10 minutes. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll just show you that if you look carefully at the next 3 slides, I found an interesting paper. I'm just repeating this quote again. This is the, sorry, yeah, just show me that one. Sorry, I meant to move it. This is, it doesn't matter. Okay, this is some research by an author called Bulan, and it's very interesting. What she does is she talks about what's happening in Sabah, where you've got generations of families that are experiencing kawin siri or kawin di bawah tangan. And so you can see this, that the first generation of this is undocumented migrants. They get married without meeting directly with parents in Indonesia because it's costly and they haven't got time. And they do it because the documentation is incomplete. You know, they've got no passport. So the Pasamakole often have no passport, etc., etc. So then they have children. Then what happens second generation? Let's see the next slide. Next slide. So second generation. It's becoming more and more, what she's showing, it's becoming more and more socially acceptable in the as these families get embedded in the community. So their children, the employer knows them, and some of them get assistance. They're known by the parents because the parents themselves are still living in Tawau. But also the problem is they're having this illegal marriage because they don't have the documentation to have a proper marriage. Then there's a third generation. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. The third generation, it's simpler and there's a lot more powerful support. So you can see that even though the law hasn't changed, as a social practice amongst these fairly stable and ongoing groups of migrants in Tawau that are having people coming and going, but basically they're people who've been there illegally for generations. It's becoming much more of an accepted social practice. But of course, the main problem that's left, so this is a community finding a solution for themselves, you know, a solution that works, and by the time you get to this third generation, the marriages are socially recognised, they're recognised by the employers, etc., which for the Bugis is really important. The akad nikah has been tacked on to a whole lot of other rituals that predate Islam, but which are about the social announcement of the, you know, the duduk bersanding, you know, the announcement of the man and woman as a couple to the community, and the feasting that it goes along with that kind of announcement and acceptance. But of course, the real issue is the children. This might have made some improvements in the regulation of the children, the marriages of the second and third generation children, but it doesn't get over the fact that these children don't have birth certificates. And so without birth certificates, either in Malaysia or in Indonesia, they're denied access to schools, health facilities, etc. So it's a very disempowering situation for these people who, after all, are only trying to do the right thing. You know, they're just trying to make a living. They're trying to go to somewhere where they can support their families, etc., etc. So, so that is the big issue. And I think if we look around the world now, there is a growing concern about situations where children don't have birth certificates. And we know that in Indonesia it's a problem. You know, they can't get, like, you can't send your children back to grandma because you haven't got a birth certificate. So unless there's a Pak Desa who's going to help you in an illicit way, you're not going to be able to get your children in school. So I'll just read a conclusion from a paper by Efanisa, who did research in Sabah amongst illegal migrants from Sulawesi. Muslims in Malaysia understand the validity of nikah kampung or nikah siri. Therefore, people in the village where I stay know when we have had nikah siri. Oh, sorry, this is a quote. I'm sorry, I'll start again. This is Nisa. This is one of Nisa's informants in the community where she was doing research in Sabah. Muslims in Malaysia understand the validity of nikah kampung or nikah siri. Therefore, people in the village where I stay know when we have had nikah siri. They will not report us to the police or immigration officers because it's valid in the eyes of God. So, you know, God and immigration regimes who, well, you know, societal pressures accompanied by religious rhetoric have resulted in the workers believing that religious marriage, which is legally prohibited but culturally licit, that's her words, culturally licit, is a legitimate way to solve their problems relating to their basic human needs. And would any of us disagree that a basic human right is the right to form a family? It's a humanitarian issue. The problem remains, especially for the rights of children of these unions who can't be issued birth certificates, so can be denied services. There have been attempts by Indonesian officials in Malaysia to regularize these marriages through conducting of isbat nikah. But this is not a simple solution because these practices face many obstacles. They're costly, they happen at a specific time, and you mightn't be able to get leave from your employer. You have to travel long distances. You might not be able to get proof from Indonesia that you weren't already married, all sorts of things. So the isbat nikah conducted by overseen by Indonesian officials in Malaysia is not really a solution. So I'll just come back again to Prof. Emma's comment. People have a fundamental right to drive decisions that affect their lives. The situation of labour migrants in Malaysia mirror some of the problems facing Australian citizens seeking to marry citizens of another country, and the similarities is in the tensions between the requirements and intentions of state migration regimes and the needs of the migrants of their families. These are human rights and humanitarian issues, but also when we're thinking about the creation of stable communities, the marriage rights of migrants and their children can't be ignored. So thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Catherine Robinson, for your insightful and inspiring keynote. Distinguished guests, please join me in extending our warmest appreciation with a round of applause for Professor Catherine Robinson. Ladies and gentlemen, before we end this morning session, we will have a photo session with all of our distinguished guests and participants. To begin, I would like to kindly invite the following guests to come forward to the front of the stage. His Excellency, Professor Dr. Kaderuddin Ayub, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, FSSK.